Your ideas are terrifying, and your hearts are faint. Your acts of pity and cruelty are absurd, committed with no calm, as if they were irresistible. Finally, you fear blood more and more. Blood in time. Paul Valery.
It is not to be thought that the life of darkness is sunk in misery and lost as if in sorrowing. There is no sorrowing, for sorrow is a thing that is swallowed up in death, and death and dying are the very life of the darkness. Jacob Boehme.
Clark, who led last year's expedition to the Afar region of northern Ethiopia, and UC Berkeley colleague Tim D. White also said that a re-examination of a 300,000-year-old fossil skull found in the same region earlier showed evidence of having been scalped. The Yuma Daily Sun, June 13th, 1982. Hey, JVH.
Hi, Candy.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing? How are you surviving snow up there?
It's really snowing, yeah.
Yeah, I was in Wisconsin. It snowed terribly, and now I'm just watching it because I've got to go out today. But yeah, we had a little bit of snow here. Not so much in the south side of Chicago, though. Makes it quiet.
That's nice, yeah.
Yeah.
Gives
So,
me an excuse to stay home.
That's true. That's true.
And
Uh,
podcast.
New podcast, a special bonus episode. We're obviously talking about the epigraphs today.
Yes, this is the paratexts episode.
I love it. I love it. Maybe we'll call it that.
Yeah, when you look into McCarthy criticism,
Mhm,
there's not really a lot of stuff on the epigraphs. There's not a lot of stuff on, well, there's not a lot of stuff on the epigraphs together,
mhm, mhm,
what they do. Usually, like you find people mostly interested in the Jakob Bohme or Jacob Boehme
mhm.
epigraph because of, the sort of broader interests in McCarthy's theological imagery and ideas.
That's
But like in terms of the Valeray quote, in terms of the Yuma Daily Sun quote, there's really not a lot of stuff. Um, and so the epigraphs are kind of overlooked, but we're here today to sort of like try to buck that
I think
and
you're right. Yeah.
and suggest that actually they kind of have an important function and they, in a way, almost prescribe to the reader some things even before they dip into the actual novel.
Well, you're right, and I think what's interesting is that it's hard to kind of know that. I suppose if you come at it with knowing the context of the epigraphs, that would help, but I it would be hard to imagine somebody, that would be quite prepared. For me, right away, I would say that the the philosophy, the German philosopher Boehm, of course you're thinking Gnosticism and Hermeticism and magic, and he was a great practicer of magic in the Renaissance, and something right up my alley. But you've got to really read a lot of their work, I think, to start and get to try to figure out what's going on with these epigraphs, and do they tell us something else about the novel? Um, I know you've had some different thoughts about where each of them are coming from.
Yeah, for sure. People, we tend to overlook epigraphs, I think, in general. Like, I mean, what are they there for anyways? Where did this practice of epigraphing come from? There's not really a lot of even just general research on like what epigraphs are, what they're for, where they came from. Like most scholarship on epigraphs, they kind of go back to like this 20th century theorist, Gerard Genet, who kind of talked about epigraphs as sort of like a, in terms of the literary tradition in Europe, something that started in the 17th century, so sort of in Bohme's time. And like they've had epigraphs kind of have different sorts of functions, right? And when we look at epigraphs, we kind of have to think about their performative dimension. You know, there is the epigraphed, who or what is epigraphed, and there is the epigrapher, who is doing the epigraphing. Is it the writer of the novel? Is it a character in the novel? Is it Cormac McCarthy who's giving us these epigraphs, or maybe is it Judge Holden? Like who would be the other sort of like learned person in the mix? And then, who is the epigraphee? Like why are we being shown these epigraphs as readers? So, there's all of this performative dimension to the epigraphs, and Jeanette also sees like the epigraphs fulfilling different kinds of functions.
Mm, mhm. Yeah. Well, on top of, thinking about the kind of, they've always struck me as originally when I first read them, they're pretty morbid. They seem very heavy. They seem already nihilistic.
Yes.
I'm sure Vereen Bell just went, oh my God, this is the stamp that makes this nihilism, And I think that they also get thrown out a lot when you're in debate about Blood Meridian and if there's any positive side or a Gnostic side or a mystical side or something at all human in Blood Meridian, or humanism rather than human. There's lots of human, but is there humanism? They always like, oh, well, look at the epigraphs. And ironically, Black Hawk Down by Bowden, he quotes Blood Meridian at the beginning of his nonfiction book. And he quotes the part about war is waiting for man. And then it says Cormac McCarthy, and it's infuriating because I feel like it has been taken out of context as well for his book.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
and in that case, like that, then Cormac McCarthy becomes an authority, right? And
correct.
that's, when people are reading this as kind of justification for nihilism or something like that, and they're quoting the epigraphs, they're implicitly kind of saying, well, these epigraphs carry authority.
Mm-hmm.
These are some kinds of authorities on the subject matter of the book, and we should, and Cormac McCarthy is authorizing what he's saying by referencing these three authorities.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's one of the functions of the epigraph, is to give kind of authority to whatever the argument of the book might be.
You're right. You're right. Um,
But I think for both of us, these epigraphs are more obscure than they might first appear. Like they have been made to look dark. I think
very
on
good point.
purpose.
Very good point. That's been one of the really kind of surprising things over the last couple of weeks of looking, and then I really, got into it the last couple of days. I realized, oh my God, I've got to I've got to get into this. It's coming down like a freight train on me. But yeah, that there's a little bit of I'm going to say, and I've said it before, that Cormac McCarthy, as much as I love him, he's not always a reliable narrator himself. And I think that we've noticed that something's going on with, never mind the overall tone, when I call it colonizer speak, the parts that bother me in that bother me as a reader and a human in Blood Meridian, which I'm not putting on him, I'm putting on the narrator and on characters, but it is all the way extended into the epigraphs. And I think one of the first things is, of course, that's not, the one thing I find in common is that they all have something to do with observing the natural world, all three of the epigraphs. And Valery, he was really into time and math. He was an incredible poet, but he was also part of the secret. If you knew there was a secret history of art, John, or any of our listeners, would you want to know? My understanding is most people would be like, well, they don't even want to know about history of art, period. Never mind a secret history of art. So I can find that all three of these epigraphs do have in common a secret history of art. because Valery was very concerned with math and it affected his poetry. He stopped writing poetry for years and really studied science and time. And he was trying to reconcile what you can't know with the material world, what was intelligent, what was unreal, and what was intelligent. And it was a real struggle. And he put it into mathematical programs in his poetry in a way. And, I used to have a friend who was I had two friends that are astrophysicists. And one of them, the one thing I kind of have in common with Cormac McCarthy, actually, I probably don't have many more personal things in common with him, except a long-term interest in science and physics, and that I have friends that were astrophysics. That's how I knew about it. And I was trying to tell him years in the 90s. He worked, um, he worked in Vancouver at Triumph. Both of them did at the particle accelerator there and at one in New York State. But that math was in poetry. And he said, well, I can see right away that poetry is a small set. And Valerie was definitely working with that. Um, but it's very hard work to spend time looking at him. He's also out of fashion. So he's when I read something yesterday that was so fantastic on symbolism, and it was about his mentor Malarm, and he was talking about it was 50 years after the symbolist movement, which was a mystical movement. And Paul Valeret is not considered at the end of his life mystical, perhaps. He's really trying to be practical and he talks in a very practical way. But there are underlying things in his work. And I found that I could even, the translation was so good that I read it was Michael Conway, I think. And it was so good that I almost heard the French almost paced like French language. It was so good. So there you could go for 2 or 3 days, and it feeds into this epigraph, and you're like, the context. Did McCarthy read this stuff? Was he a big believer in fascinated by his work? And I think he probably was because of that science end of things. Um,
I think so too. Yeah. I mean, the more you fan out in Valerie's writing, the more you might find in common with McCarthy's sort of late modernism, right? Like Valerie was, yeah, he was like a student of Mallarmé and a symbolist, but he was also reading like German philosophy, and he had these kind of idealized intellectual heroes that he would write portraits of, like Leonardo da Vinci. And when you,
Definitely.
when you read like his portrait of Leonardo, it's like very much looking kind of like a description of the judge who is, can do this, do that, do everything. He can sketch, he can, fiddle, he can dance, he can
You're right.
lecture on geology, he can, so that kind of, intellectual hero figure is definitely coming from Valerie.
Mhm.
And I mean, it's of course like good that you mention math and science, and yeah, like how Valerie sort of like spent his later life more as a philosopher than as a poet.
Mhm.
Because one like neither of us have been to the McCarthy archives yet, and
Right.
of course this is like a big gap in our experience and stuff like that hopefully we'll be able to make up for one day. But we do like read stuff from scholars who have gone to the archives,
That's
so
right.
we know like from Michael Cruz's book that um, the Paul Valeret quote is not really directly lifted from from the Yalu essay, right?
Right.
He McCarthy apparently found it first in another book where it was excerpted. This book is like by um, I think a Hungarian American physicist or philosopher of science
Mhm.
named J.T. Fraser, who wrote a book called Of Time, Passion, and Knowledge that Cruz, looking at evidence in the archives, says McCarthy was reading at the time he was writing Blood Meridian. And yeah, in Fraser's book, you find like 9 sentences of Valerie's The Yalu, and McCarthy takes 3 of those 9 sentences and uses it for his epigraph. So like there is like um, science and empiricism, and it's funny that the sentence ends with blood and time, and that he he took this excerpt from a philosophy book on the philosophy of time, which, you know, and in that book, time is understood as a kind of it has a conflictual model. So there's like, time is a war of temporalities.
Correct. Yes.
There's like the atemporal time of primordial matter energy, and all the way up through different kinds of temporalities, each with their own sort of world, So our experience is an experience of the conflict of these different temporalities.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean I don't even know if those three sentences were in the exact order that they were in the short story, to be honest with you. There might have been a gap between them. I don't want to say that I could, but I thought that I had the impression it was, but he really has minimalized. And then you've got blood and time, which is blood meridian, and meridian's got a reference to time as well.
Hmm.
So it's kind of interesting that way. And I've mentioned this before in an earlier episode, is that all artwork is time based. It's a painting is 1 second. It's a one still moment. If you see a still life, that's one frozen moment of time. If you look at Monet, now Monet, Valery, he was friends with tons of impressionists, and they were very concerned with the movement of light in their artwork. He may have even married, or his mistress was an impressionist painter. He had a mistress for a long time, but he was deep into that culture of art and cafe society and philosophy. And those paintings by Monet, the haystacks, he has them in every season. He has them in spring, summer, December. So when you see them all together, they become much more interesting than when you just see them in a magazine. They are records of a time. So in the Illuminati, one of the things we look for is that they're clues. About the secret history of art, I just kind of want to put this in here because it does make sense over the stuff we're going to be talking about. Is in the secret history of art, you're looking for time factoring, calendrical structure, and numerical composition. And obviously, Valery, as a poet, would have that, and he would be concerned with that, with the Impressionists and with his interest in science. He also happened to be interested in topology. Topology was an emerging science in his time period. So some of his last works, he was really obsessed with it, which we find out McCarthy applies in his characters in his last twin novels. So I found that kind of interesting too. And he must have known that. I would assume he's so well read that he would know a fair bit about his lifetime and his work, Valerie.
Yeah, I would imagine so. Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, history as well, right? Like, I think we have to definitely move from time to history. I mean, so the Yalu is kind of like it's a dialogue between like well, probably Valerie's sort of like a character that he created named Monsieur Test,
Hmm.
like which might translate into Mr. Testicle,
Okay.
um,
Yeah.
who was sort of like Valerie's kind of like intellectual hero, always looking to improve their knowledge and stuff like that. And so the Yalu as a dialogue takes place near the riverbanks of the Yalu River, and it takes place between a Chinese scholar and Monsieur Test, who is like a French intellectual. And the Chinese scholar is they're talking about the outbreak of the first China-Japan War, which I think happened in like 1894.
Right.
And like so history is involved here too, right? And different kinds of social organizations. So the whole dialogue and the epigraph that we read is actually a statement spoken by the Chinese scholar to the French intellectual about Western civilization. So when we read, your ideas are terrifying and your hearts are faint, your acts of pity and cruelty, the you or the person being addressed is Western civilization.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
So there is this kind of Valery sets up this opposition between two social forms, right? One kind of Chinese, a kind of an Orientalist fantasy of like a stable order through time. And then maybe what is really the real object of Valeray's writing is like a critique of Western society as based on catastrophe and
Mm,
continual warfare.
mm.
And so, like that, we have to also kind of take into consideration, like, because in some ways, this statement, your ideas are terrifying, it's a judgment on the
Yes,
West, right?
yes.
And so, maybe we should be reading this epigraph as a judgment on the material we're going to be reading.
That's so insightful. I agree with you. Because right away we do find out the backstory is that conversation comes from a war dialogue. And I couldn't help but think about the if it was published and translated right into the New York Times in 1971, how that would have played out with the Vietnam War. If you were
Yeah.
reading
Yeah.
it during that time period, I wonder what that felt like. To have this short story translated, and I do recommend that people read the whole thing.
Yeah, it's an amazing piece of literature. It's actually
Yes.
really quite beautiful. Like it's in a way it's kind of reminiscent of the structure of Blood Meridian, right?
Hmm.
Like, by which I mean like Blood Meridian begins and ends with a total imaginative scenario, right? Like the kid is not real. That's McCarthy's fictional, it's a fictional frame around real historical material.
Hmm.
So the historical material of the Glanton gang or the Glanton gang narrative is based on historical material, but the beginning and end with the birth and the death or whatever happens to the kid at the end, that's all made up, right? It's all fantastic.
Yes.
Um, and the Yalu is sort of like that too, right? It begins with this like very like symbolist,
Hmm.
surrealist, um, synesthetic narrative about being next to the water, and then it ends with, this amazing description of him going for a swim.
Hmm. Yeah, that is very like dancing in the water. Well, and you're reminding me too that I wanted to say that the word orient, it comes up in the story or it's in a publication of Valerie's. It could also be positioning. There could be some symbolism, like you said in the story, and an allegory. And it reminded me, and you're reminding me right now, that we found out that there were manuscripts after Cormac McCarthy passed away, and they've been put into the archives. And one of them is called The Campaign. Before Cormac McCarthy wrote Blood Meridian, he intended to set it in Mongolia or China. And this manuscript is that original manuscript, which made me wonder how much this had influenced him as well. But and I think to his credit, I'm very glad he changed it to the American West because I think it would have been cultural appropriation to keep it in Mongolia, and it wasn't natural to him. I think he did something very profound. Instead of pointing fingers at another society, he points the fingers at his own society. And but we do get to read the campaign. It's available to be read very soon in the archives. And apparently it makes Blood Meridian look like day camp. That's what like a daycare center. That's what his brother Dennis McCarthy told me. And he said it's quite violent. So I wonder how much that also positioned him and re
It's true, yeah, yeah. No, I think like, this is a historical novel,
yeah.
but it's not like looking at a particular moment of the past and of the American past in particular at arm's length. It's not, there's no like separation between then and the now that McCarthy was writing in, and um it's also kind of interesting that the Yalu River was a site of military conflict between the Americans and the Chinese in the 1950s.
Oh, wow.
So like I feel like sort of like the way McCarthy describes the kid as all history is present in that visage or visage. I think all of history is present in the visage of 1850, Glanton Gang, American Southwest, these particular events that they resonate
Yeah.
and they sort of include other events.
Yeah, you're right. You gave me an incredible essay to read that just kind of portrayed the sensitivity and the kind of some artists, and I would put Cormac like this, Andy Warhol, Jackson Pollock, Valerie, some artists and Roberto Bolano are able to transcend time and create an artifact that is really brilliant. And I did think of one of my favorite novels, 2666, when I read the short story from excerpt. I think I read the whole story. I found it online from the New York Times, actually. And I did think of 2666, where it's an indictment of academia, intelligence, and art, and how we reprogram it. And it's ultimately about the corporatization of art, the 2666. And I think we've got that in Blood Meridian too, once we get to the scalping, that we have the corporatization, not of art, corporatization of evil, I meant to say, not of art, but of evil. And I think that two novels have that in common. And it's touched upon in that short story, The Yalu. And I just had a haunting feeling of timelessness and a correlation between them all. It was, he really is something.
I really,
All of them
yeah.
are. I meant Valerie, but all of them.
It is, it's a odd thruppling of sources, these epigraphs, Paul Valéry, like late 19th, early 20th century, like French poet and philosopher.
Mhm,
Jacob Bohme or Jacob Boehme,
mhm.
like he's a 17th century German theologian slash philosopher, and then the Yuma Daily Sun is like a newspaper from
Yeah,
Arizona, like
yeah,
that, had anyway, it's just a weird, it looks kind of random and incongruous at first.
right.
But
Bohm was
I
actually
think,
a peer, I think, of Shakespeare.
pardon me?
I think Bohm was almost a peer of Shakespeare. He's about 10 years younger than him, and he died 10 years after him. And they were both, 50, 47 or 50. So he was really part of the Renaissance, rather, I would call 16th century, I think.
Right.
But I could be mixed up my dates, but I would consider him more 16th century, which is even more bizarre because after that, we really, whatever was going on in the Renaissance in terms of the secret history of art, it became more and more fragmented. And it's a tradition that I long term argue is what McCarthy is working in. He's also working in it. But so to me, that's what, once we started going down the lane of Jacob Boehm, I'm going to mess up their name so badly. Please forgive me. Um, but yeah, when we move into his quote, it's
Yeah.
quite interesting from, you're right. If you read this all in a sentence without their names breaking it up, it would be very weird. Um, there is no sorrowing. He really was concerned with, again, non-duality, and so was Valerie, about finding the unreal with the intelligent, which you don't think of them going together, the material and the spiritual. Whereas in other cultures, they are the same thing, materialism and spiritualism, they're not separated. Once we got into European Enlightenment, we divided them up. However, they were still connected in the time of Bohème. He was very concerned. They weren't Freemasons, oddly enough, but they really were. Valerie would have come out of an intense culture of Freemasonry in France. I believe he was kind of trying to project it and to write works that didn't depend on that. I think he thought of it as like a conspiracy theory at his point. I shouldn't say that because he was obsessed with um, was it John the Baptist? He was, or St. John in the Cross. He's obsessed with one of those fellows for being not an atheist, but almost, you know. But Boehm would have he influenced a huge German um Freemasonry cult. They apparently, like in the bookstores, they couldn't find any other books because everyone was obsessed with reading him at his time. You're on with the Freemasons. And so that is kind of interesting. He wasn't a Freemason himself, I don't think, but he was a Hermetic. So, that does
I
inform it.
mean, I think the Freemasons were at like they came at later in the 18th century, right? Like in the
Yeah, yeah,
1780s something,
yeah,
and Burma died
yeah.
in
1647, maybe, or
1720.
oh, he did. So I am wrong about his birth date. Okay, sorry about that. My
No,
bad.
no, late. I think he's born. late. Well, he Shakespeare would have been older than him.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I did mix up my dates. Sorry about that.
But when for Bohme, like for me, again, like I think, when McCarthy readers take this quote up, they kind of take it up in a kind of religious or theological register.
Hmm.
Um, which makes sense, of course, because six theosophic points is kind of, like about here, this is what the being of God is, and the non-being of God is like made of an ungroundedness that is both a will and an I, and then a ground is found, and that is Father, and the Father is fire and wrath, and like so he has this whole kind of philosophical explanation of the Christian Trinity. And
Hmm.
so like when I read him, I read him as like I read him in the history of German philosophy.
That makes sense.
So like, Hegel
Oh,
would have called Bohme or did call Bohme in his lectures on the history of philosophy, like the kind of first German to bring philosophy or to make philosophy German or something like that. And he writes a really interesting, or I have a quote here from Hegel on Bohme. The matter of his philosophy is genuinely German, for what marks him out and makes him noteworthy is the Protestant principle already mentioned of placing the intellectual world within one's own mind and heart, and of experiencing and knowing and feeling in one's own self-consciousness all that was formerly conceived as a beyond.
mm,
So, I mean, like Bohme is like the beginning of a philosophical interest in notions of the will, and the will as kind of primary and and has having ontological primacy in reality, right? First, there is a will to be, and then there is being. So will, and so we do have this kind of fascination with the will right at the beginning of Blood Meridian with, um, is the will just another piece of clay, that
right,
question.
absolutely. Page 4 on our edition, I think. And yeah, I would say the argument of the novel, in a very old-fashioned way, even though people don't do that anymore. But it looks like McCarthy really did position that. Yes, we find out right away, are we doing free will? Are we being manipulated like puppets or clay? And we're already seeing some motifs of that following through in our when we're reading our chapters. Yeah.
And this epigraph is it's marked by a kind of violence because, as Petra Mundik has pointed out in her book, I think from 2016, that the epigraph is three sentences, but what we don't know is that McCarthy has excised an entire clause and cut the very last sentence, cut off a part of it as well. So he's actually edited and revised this. Uh, so he's abstracted it from the Bohme text, and then he's further kind of abstracted it by editing out a sentence that would have made the whole sense of the sentence quite a bit different than what it is now, right? Because now it kind of, I think Petra Mundik kind of says that, it almost seems like a justification for evil, for human evil, right?
Mm-hmm.
The life of darkness is, there's nothing wrong with that. There's no sorrow. It's just a kind of life. But what is missing is from the original context is that Bohme is actually kind of, he has this idea of reality as being composed of the external world and then two inner worlds, the world of darkness, which is the world of the Father, and the world of light, which is the world of the Son. And so we're actually like, living in three worlds that are superimposed. And so he's actually talking not about material reality, but about, what the life of the dark world is about. But that is obscured in the way that McCarthy has revised the epigraph.
Right. And were joking about that, how he's almost the suzerain of, like the judge, of deciding
Right. Yeah.
going
Yeah.
to put in these epigraphs, and that's why I'm like, I don't trust this guy. Well, he told Oprah, she asked him, "What's 117 mean?" And he goes, "I
Yeah.
don't remember." I'm like, BS. You don't have to tell. I wouldn't tell either as an artist. You shouldn't explain your backstory. But I do believe he does remember, you know?
Yeah.
Don't believe him. And that's okay. That's you have to be as if you're an artist, you have to be mysterious and you have to hide your sources. But he's hiding the sources of other people too. And you're right, it controls the tone. And the same as Valerie's, is that you get this idea that if you're afraid of blood in time, there's some weakness in you or so. It just is very confusing. And when without the context, they do add to the mood of going into it, though, that we are going to have it's a dark curtain opening on the theater of Blood Meridian, these
Yeah.
epigraphs,
It's
definitely.
it's almost like uh encouraging a misreading. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So it's almost like yeah, purposefully misleading. But but you know, at the same time as you could say it's misleading, it's also kind of protective. It is,
But
protecting its treasures, to the reader who will do the extra work.
well, and which is the work of an alchemist. I mean, because Boehm, I want to say he was an alchemist. He practiced magic. And one thing about magic is I understand if people are listening right now, and I do talk about this, for 10 years I've been doing these presentations on the secret history of art. And, to eye rolls and whatever, it's taken me a long time to get a rapport and people starting to people didn't just ask me a question at the panels. I'd be like, damn, I've got to do this. Back to the drawing board. How do I get this? And you were in Knoxville. I was like, oh, a couple people, they asked me some questions.
Right,
Must
yeah.
be getting there. I must be getting there soon. But he believed in hidden knowledge, and that is part of this weird thing in the quote about lightness and darkness and sorrowing. The sorrowing is almost related to the notion of suffering in Buddhism. It's that it's something that is it's part of a spectrum. It's part of the spectrum of experience. And you know how when you have melancholy or sorrow, it's almost one of the techniques to be opening up your consciousness. You don't want to be depressed all the time. You don't want depression, but that kind of sensitivity is part of his practice. So Bohm would have believed. Okay, so we don't have to believe in magic. You're a contemporary person. You're listening to a podcast on Spotify right now, and these two jerks are talking about the beginning of Blood Meridian, and you can go, magic, give me a break, right? The judge doesn't believe in magic. He just tricks people. But Bohm and these practitioners of alchemy, they really did believe in magic. So we have to know that they believed in it. And it was a serious way. It was like a meditation. It was like there is no magic without ritual. And they used many rituals. Whether it was those three globes that you're saying, those would have been very ritualistic practices. It would have been a metaphor. And then they would have probably had some kind of theater or room where he would use that. And Valerie would have known about this too. He would have been very aware because he was living in a very trendy area of Freemasons. I mean, the French Freemason was one of the biggest. It was called the Order of the Orient, which of course made me think about his story and whether there's something going on in that too about trying to negotiate between the unreal and the intelligible. And so Boehm would have also felt that the world and God were the same thing. There wouldn't have been a separation there for him. There is for us in our society. And then matter and mind would not have been separated. And that goes back to this idea of Hermeticism and Gnosticism or Buddhism, a monism. So for anybody out there who's a science geek, there's a fantastic book just came out called Enrique Pi by Enrique Pi called The One. And this guy, he's just ripping off Buddhism. He'll go 3,000 years ago to Plato. And I do like the book and I do recommend it because it's a relief to me. See, I was right. So he's suggesting to physicists now, stop with trying to negotiate between this duality. Just accept monism. Just accept that that everything is connected and then the math will follow. And I'm like, yeah, science is always the last one to the game, right? You've got 15,000 years of research on meditation and oneness, and science is like, oh, guess what? It's about the one. But I do recommend it. It's an excellent book. But again, already Bohm would have been into that. He would have already been practicing that and or trying to attain it, trying to find, is it, where do I situate myself in my practice to be, because that's where all creativity is. And that's where all the imagination is. So you want to harness that as either a philosopher or a poet. So those two have that in common. They would have had rituals, and Valery's ritual was every morning. Right away, he wrote this diary for 40 years or something.
Yeah, that's right, the Cayenne.
Right? Yeah. So his ritual was that, and there's almost no other way to explain it as a metaphor except a spiritual practice to be that dedicated. I know me sometimes, and he would be before sunrise. So there's an indication too. There's something about, that's a mystical time too, right? Oh, I didn't mean to talk so much, John. Took off there. I got all excited.
Well, I mean, Burma, I was interested in the way the sixth Theosophic points ends
Please,
with a kind
please.
of because for Burma, he's I kind of characterize him as part of the Baroque, right? The beginning of the 17th century. And
Mm,
so Baroque ideas of chiaroscuro, like you need the shadows. You can't get rid of the shadows. You need the darkness. You can't get rid of it. And so I was kind of saying this in like the chapter two episode that we did.
mm,
This idea of, evil has to be something that is made. And what is evil made out of? It's made out of what Bohme would call darkness, like the wrath, the stinging, the anguish that
mhm.
is necessary to bring something into being. Because, for Bohme, God just wants to become manifest to itself. And so
Right.
in order to do that, it has to, in some ways, contract into substance and destroy the substance, and in order for the fire to be generated, and only in the generation of fire will light be possible, and you can only become manifest if there is light, right? So Bohme has this idea that, dark and light are always together, and you can't turn the dark into light, and the dark will never be able to turn the light into darkness either. There's always going to be both. You need both.
Uh,
Um, and so there's always this kind of war going on, between dark and light, even though they need each other. And so the way that the sixth Theosophic points ends is this kind of spiritualization of the idea of fighting, right? And so
mhm.
this cosmology of darkness and light becomes an ethics of, like, well, if the world is like this, then how are we to be and how are we to live and stuff like that. And so, there has to be a fight of the old Adam against the new Adam, the old man against the new man or something like that. So it is about a ontological transformation of the self. And there is a fighting going on. And so I kind of wanted to mention that too, because Blood Meridian is a book about war, but and fighting and polemics, these can take place in all sorts of different kinds of modalities, right? It doesn't have to
Absolutely.
be bloodshed. Like it doesn't have to be killing.
Absolutely.
And, yeah.
John, you've said the best thing because this is again the kind of perversion that we do with things. We go intellectual, which the guy in the story of the Euless, intellectualism is like death, and it is. It's completely not the way to approach any part of life. Listen, I like I can go to the cafe and talk politics too, but you this idea of the darkness is that blood meridian is the perversion of that darkness, and war is a perversion of it. You're absolutely right that there's other modalities. Again, we've talked about this part of the science of surprise is that you learn from novelty. So when you're arguing and you have different points of view, just when you're, the reason we make children and kids go to debate club is because the learning is massive when you argue. So arguing isn't a downfall. And you and I have argued for many years. And when we were on the Cormac McCarthy forum, it was all arguing. And then there's a little judgment about, oh, you guys are assholes. No, it's all fair in love and war, but love and war in argument, in debate. Um, it is it you're the learning capacity that you get from those kinds of um fighting is absolutely imperative, and that is part of what you're feeling. And when you have an ego death, or when you're going into a battle with your own mind to become spiritual, or to even be to be a philosopher, you've got to struggle to find the time to do it. You have to find the struggle to forget about making dinner, or, oh my God, my body is demanding that I get sleep. We're always in a struggle, and that's not going to go away, but it can be even as simple as that. You know, yes, this is very important to realize about those quotes, is they are taken supremely out of context. And their meaning, which is also what politics do. That's also what control systems do. William Burroughs, where I mentioned calendrical design, he said, as soon as you get a hold of time and the calendar, you're the control, you're the power. And that's why fascists hate art. They hate poetry, and it's amazing they haven't banned Blood Meridian, because if they really understood it, they would. In the United States, they would be banning it, because instead you've got the fascist right wing adopting these quotes in Blood Meridian, and this kind of warmongering, and this idea that, well, war waits for man. Which is why I've always wanted, okay, it's a good thing you made him an asshole, because you put this in these books and it could be misunderstood so easily, you know? This is why we're analyzing it and looking at it,
Yes.
because it's frightening to think of someone co-opting, art and poetry for evil. And I think that McCarthy is showing us that in these epigraphs. And you've pointed it out to me in a way that I never looked at before, and I deeply appreciate it. It's
Uh,
really made me think about it. And you pointed out the Yuma Sun article, the whole article of the Yuma Sun. We haven't even talked about that yet.
yeah.
So the quote, and this has come up, we have argued about this too, about, oh, it's a proof of scalping that we're assholes. We're just murderous jerks, right?
Yeah.
But the whole article, tell me about that, if you can.
Well, so the article is from a 1982 edition of the Yuma Daily Sun, a now defunct paper. I think it's just called the Yuma Sun now.
Mm.
So it's changed ownership, but the article was called "Fossil Remains of Oldest Ancestor of Man Found." I'm not sure if that's very common knowledge. The article was attributed to Associated Press science writer Robert Locke,
Mm.
and it provides details on certain paleoanthropological findings from a pair of UC Berkeley scientists. So the British scientist J. Desmond Clark, and then the American scientist Tim D. White. And I think it was White, and maybe White and Clark, who first proposed the existence of the Australopithecine,
Mhm.
as a kind of transitional species. And there was like a bit of a controversy, I think, in the 70s. But they found this 300,000-year-old skull of an Australopithecine. So it's not a Homo sapiens skull,
Mhm.
but a precursor to, I guess, the hominids. Um, and yeah, they claim that it bore traces of scalp marks. You know, and it's been kind of
Scalp
interesting.
marks, you mean scrapes on the skull.
Yeah, they put this cranium, which otherwise had no trauma to it. Okay, so there was no head bashing in or anything like that. It didn't seem to bear marks of violence other than these what looked like deliberate cutting marks. So, in the newspaper article that McCarthy quotes from, the word scalping is mentioned.
Mhm.
Um, Scalping is mentioned in a couple of other articles about the same find that I've found in like science journals from 1982. Um, but in there, it uh, it there tends to be in the science writing, like scalping isn't used, I think, for fear of misunderstanding it as a kind of violent act that takes place during war, and they tend to call it defleshing.
Defleshing, yes.
So again, like I don't know if there's and I doubt that there is and probably won't be for a long time until we invent time travel and actually go back and see, that there's any consensus on why these skulls had their scalps removed deliberately. It could have been some kind of funeral practice. It could have been cannibalism. Um, but it doesn't seem to be, Tim D. White in another article says he cannot fathom any economic reason for the scalping to have occurred, which is precisely the reasons why scalping occurs in Blood Meridian, right? It's all economic driven. Or that is, I don't know, the efficient cause of the scalping, if not, I would like to get into, and I think we should probably do like a special episode on that horrible screenplay, Whales and Men.
Well, I think we will
Which,
do that then. I love that idea. It'll be a special bonus episode.
yeah, which
Yeah.
as a drama maybe isn't the best, but it is interesting in terms of its ideas. And there too, like McCarthy talks about. So like, here we're talking about the origins of the species, right? From a scientific point of view in this third epigraph. And and it because it's related to scalping and because scalping is in the novel. And in the novel, scalping is related to the violence of warfare. Readers may tend to short circuit and think that the scalping mentioned in the epigraph and the scalping going on in the novel, that somehow they're exactly the same.
Right. No. Off the top of my head, I'm thinking Memento Mori. I mean, that's
Right.
true. You can't go back in time. We can't know what a shipwreck, what can we look at artwork, a shipwreck, and the ship is in the ocean and they're flailing around? Well, I'm pretty sure I know how I'd feel in that painting. If that was me, I'd be scared shitless. And so why can't we know? We are still connected to, we're all primates.
Sure,
We
yes.
we can watch primates and bonobos or chimpanzees, and we see so many cross intertextual things with them. Even some of the bonobos teach their babies to wash potatoes. We're so arrogant, we think we're different. But I think that that skull could be memento mori, like a 17th century Dutch painting where you have the Bible and a candle and a skull. Why wouldn't that skull be fascinating to an Australopithecus? Why that maybe that was their mother, maybe that was their sister or their lover, and they don't want to let them go. And when the flesh rotted, they kept scraping it off to keep it, and maybe put it on an altar of some sort or keep it with them. Maybe it's like Wilson and Tom
Yeah.
and Hanks.
Right. Yeah, yeah.
Wilson, I just need someone to hang out with. Um, it could be
That
art.
too is a leathery.
Yes. And remember, he has the blood on it. He uses his hand, which
Right.
emulated the cave painting with the hands on it, right? I thought that was clever in Castaway. It could be art and it could be ritualistic. It really could be ritualistic that it is something to stare at, and maybe pray or feel you know, like we would. Why wouldn't it be different? Animals know when there's many animals have culture. It's just the Enlightenment people who were programmed by Europe. I'm lucky I wasn't as programmed by it, but they were programmed to think that animals weren't like us. The inventions and the innovations that came from animal study came from Asia because they didn't see themselves in their religions. They don't see themselves hierarchical to animals. So there was this massive advance in observing animal behavior coming out of Asian countries, not from Europe, because they're like, man,
Yeah.
you know.
That would make sense too in indigenous cultures on this continent.
Correct. It would make sense. Absolutely. There is only respect and an interconnected lifestyle, right? Not like our totalitarian agriculture where we, lock up our food and put it in fences and shit like that.
Well,
Um,
and speaking of agriculture versus, some other kind of economy,
mhm.
and in Whales and Men, like one character kind of talks about, you know, um, the human sort of like heritage as being like partially derived from um, our ape ancestors, right? And partially being derived from our observations of hunter species like wolves.
Right.
And so, like, and this character seems to think that all that is best in humanity is derived from the hunter. Um, the kind of learning how to be socially by watching like a hunter species like wolves. And our apish ancestry is what is at the root of our violence and self-destruction. Because I think in the 70s, like just as I think while McCarthy probably was like researching and writing Blood Meridian, and then in the earlys with Whales and Men, like Diane Fossey and like all the famous
Mhm.
primatologists were coming back with reports of like chimpanzees staging like murderous raids, and like and
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, but to qualify that, that was their habitat was encroached upon. So it wasn't really that they were in the wild. Their habitat was being restricted.
but
So
that was in the I think that was in the wild.
well, we're calling it wild for you and I, but it's
True,
not
yeah.
that wild because their
Yeah.
habitat was being encroached upon by one, poachers, and two, cities and and residents. So they weren't that the area where gorillas and those primates live is much smaller than it used to be. We're not really getting a full thing. But I get your point. They were coming back with shit like that and saying, look, we're all evil. But I do think that was a misreading as well. I do think that's a really, and back to this primate thing, if we're looking at our ape culture, we could the reason I don't feel that that skull was necessarily a murderous thing, it could have been like an observational science thing too, like what is inside of us. And second of all, because we found that primate humans have been buried with flowers and ornamental things. And I mean before the Egyptians. I mean they found very, very old, you know, 80,000-year-old grave sites that have flowers and jewels and beads and stuff, or, fragments of cultural artifacts with them that seems to be respecting their life. And Canadian anthropologist Hugh Brody describes the Inuit going out like hunting whales and hunting seals, and they always took a pouch of fresh water with them. It wasn't for them, it was for the dead whale. Thank you for giving us your life. So, yes, we have a murderous survival part, but Wade Davis suggests that maybe we made religion to reconcile the fact that we have to murder what we love. We have to live off what we love. And I read a great thing, maybe by Thomas Merton, where, the original reading was following animals and following the stars. It wasn't through text, it was the visuals of tracking animals. So I do agree 100% that the hunter has enforced our reading. That is reading. And that we've built up these stories from there. That story you want to remember, where did you catch that antelope last year? What was the weather like then? Where were the stars at that time? We got to go back to that area again. So I think you're dead right on that. And
Yeah, and like
but don't over.
thinking about the epigraph like indication of scalping as a
Mhm,
kind of repetition.
mhm,
Um, in Whales and Men, there's a moment where somebody says something like, "We're going to hunt all the whales to extinction,
mhm,
not because of like their commercial value or their value as produce, I think." They put, but because of their sacrificial value, because we don't understand what the whale is, and in that lack of understanding, it's almost like an affront, and so we have to kill it.
mhm.
So, there's hunting on the one hand, but then there's killing on the other hand, right? Like, so hunting for subsistence or for, like that is, a necessity, but killing is a kind of reaction to being affronted by the mystery of something.
Yes. Well, look at the
That, that is, from the point of view of the character in Whales and Men, it's like, we need to sacrifice, and that's where like the killing impulse as opposed to the hunting impulse comes in, and
Hmm.
maybe in that way, I don't know if Whales and Men tries to link the killing impulse with our simian heritage, with the ape in us as opposed to, the hunter in us.
Right, that would be good to look into. Well, you're right. And also what we define as hunting. Again, Hugh Brody, he says we define hunting as getting a bunch of dogs and guns and horses and chasing a fox. That's not hunting. That's
Yeah.
not, that's just fucking psycho, and the same with the conflict, Again, back to what you're saying is that the level of conflict. Um, when there's resource scarcity, perhaps like the primates that were observed by Jane Goodall, um, you start fighting, and what Blood Meridian is at the very, this is where the resource scarcity that is coming to the head. This will, yeah, it might be the last place we can tell if there's a good spirit of human nature. It's also the last place we actually can just go get food without going to a grocery store, And to our right was that we're supposed to go outside and get food. We're just supposed to lock it up and, we're supposed to go outside, get some water and get some food and have a party. You're not supposed to, and chat and look at the stars and tell stories. That's sort of bullshit. But when you get resource scarcity, different economies emerge, right? Different economies emerge. Whew, I don't know. I
Well,
don't.
yeah, so like we go from these three epigraphs seeming
Yes,
kind of random and like incongruous. They don't, why are they kind of all, they are all maybe a little bit misleading in terms of like they seem to endorse the evil and violence, but maybe actually they don't do
right.
that.
Maybe they don't.
You
You
know,
know,
I
well,
was I was gonna say, one thing we haven't talked about that I kind of find odd, and one way to kind of make sense of them together, like Valerie was an artist,
yes,
right? And he was looking at history. And Bohme, let's call him a philosopher. At least that's how I call him. And then, he's looking at like God and the absolute. And the Yuma Daily Sun, it's not really the Yuma Daily Sun that's being quoted. It's the scientist, right? The British scientist, Clark. So we have like art, philosophy, and science cited as authorities at the very beginning of the novel. And so, what is going to be, judged in the novel will be judged from the point of view of art, philosophy, and science. And
okay.
it is interesting that all of the authorities, Valerie, Bohme, and Clark is the one who's cited.
Mhm.
Um, so we have a French person, a German person, and a Brit and an English person. And so it's like Europeans, it's like the
Mhm.
authority is coming from Europe and it's passing judgment on something in America, which I think might be kind of sort of funny or satirical or something. I don't know. I
It
feel like
might
there's
be.
something there.
It might be. And that it's, that kind of that 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 perversion is really of violence is really coming from Europe, which makes more sense. Again, that can talk about resource scarcity, right? They killed every animal over there before they got here to kill the animals here. So that
Right.
definitely does make sense. Definitely makes sense. Um, I like that. I like that there's, those three different vocations are referenced. It's quite a good idea. It's quite cool. I wanted to mention too about not being able to understand necessarily because things have been taken out of it, that it does remind me of I'm going to quote two Paz today. Octavio Paz is when he was talking about poetry. He said, here we're using a language that we write newspapers with, whether it's Spanish or English. So you've got your newspaper and you're making a report. But when it comes to poetry and mysticism, I think of like, I'm going to give you this example is like, let's say we're in a hotel, John, and we walk by a conference of computer programmers. They're speaking our language, but technical usage of the same language means we don't know what they're saying. And in
Yes.
that way, this hidden meaning in Valerie and Bohème, and maybe even the skull, because that's so we're not going to feel confident today about something like that unless we look at other primates and behaviors or animals. But their hidden knowledge is like they're using the same language we use, but it has markers that are it's a technical language of poetry and
Okay.
philosophy and
Yeah.
mysticism. And, to see it cut up and be used like that is what control systems do, isn't it? So I do feel that's part of what he's doing is he's showing the narrator of this novel is also like the judge cutting up things and making it fit its narrative. I mean, he has a famous quote, McCarthy, from the New York Times about, I won't quote the whole thing there, but there is no life without bloodshed. And it gets quoted all the time. And I have an answer for that. Two can play this game, buddy. Childbirth. Childbirth. There is no life without bloodshed. And
Yeah.
so childbirth. So it's how you play with statistics, how you play with the framework, right? And
But what does he mean by bloodshed? Is it just like a metaphor for effort? I mean,
that's what I said childbirth for.
in
He, I,
turn,
exactly. What does he mean by bloodshed? And I mean, I do agree with him that if you just accept things, then your life will become vacuous. Because that's a part two of the quote, right? Which we should probably talk about at another time, maybe as well, because it does feed into Blood Meridian, maybe a little
oh
bit.
yeah, it will feed into the scene, the last scene where the kid and the judge meet in the bar in Fort Griffin because they ta start talking about the guy without a hat.
Ah,
And
yeah.
that's the guy who has lived his life vacuously,
Mhm,
and the
mhm,
intended architecture of his life has been altered as a result.
mhm, mhm. And I think that even feeds into us looking at these epigraphs, is that if we just take them at face value, um, I think he's suggesting to American readers, get out there and read these thinkers. Get out there and look at the whole humus. I'd like to believe that. I'm going to give him the benefit of doubt that he wants that he's,
No,
inspired. You could never go wrong reading either of those two philosophers. It's just an incredible rabbit hole. I want to quickly
and
quote
the
some.
same goes with
Oh,
paleoanthropology.
absolutely. Well, we do love our paleontology. Yeah. I love my anthropology for sure. And which also brings it to the ritualist thing I want to bring back was the Venus fertility figures. They're not fertility figures per se. That was like somebody on the outside saying, "Oh, it must be like for women to get pregnant easy or worshiping that." They also had notches on them. They also had scrapings on them. So I feel like the skulls might be related to the Venus figurines. I think you know the ones I mean, and I'm sure our readers.
Yes,
A
I
very
think
robust female figure, but she had notches by her vulva that count like 28. I mean, they had scratches on them. So it's possible, again, I'm repeating myself, that women were the first mathematicians. That the lunar calendar is also a much more reliable calendar than the sun. Marking your days by the moon is more efficient than the sun.
and possibly women were the first poets as well, like or
Ah,
at least the first poet in like maybe what would become the Western tradition from
mm,
ancient Sumer is Enhuadena, who was like a Sumerian priestess of Venus, actually, or
I'm
of
so familiar with this Sumerian. It's called an
Ishtar
astral myth.
or Inanna,
Yeah, this is
right? Yeah,
Illuminati.
and
Yeah.
yeah, the
Sorry.
yeah, I mean they were pastoralists, I think. So they like the ancient Sumerians. So I think they did kind of like live by the stars, and they would build cities, I think, but just to kind of sleep in at night. But otherwise, they were pastoralists.
Totally. In fact, I've used that Sumerian, it's called an astral myth when you look at it in terms of celestial value of her representing Venus, to compare to Malkina in The Counselor, who has she's doing a whole global trip throughout that narrative. But yes, the astral myths are what's really wonderful is that there's so many people doing work on this now. Whereas it had been and this is part of the secret history of art, by the way. It's exactly what you're initiated into when you study Hermeticism or the Emerald Tablet alchemy or the Illuminati, is that they all have this in common with the as above, so below. So her storyline is a map and a mnemonic device of the travels of Venus in that astral myth, you know, which I think the kid is and the judge is. I think the judge might be the sun. Um, very, very inspiring, John. Thank you. I wanted to I think this is a nice quote because it kind of ties into what I was saying about if we walked by computer programmers or lawyers. If you hear a lawyer talking, you're like you think you understand, then you realize you have no idea because his usage of the same words is technical. And that's why you can hide secret messages in poetry and in a novel like this. So Bohme, I found this wonderful quote. For according to the outward man, we are in this world, and according to the inward man, we are in the inward world. Since then, we are generated out of both worlds. We speak two languages, and we must be understood also by two languages. So I thought that really suited what our approach today with these epigraphs, you know? And if you come at the novel as an outward, you know, maybe almost a superficial, you're going to miss. And that, I mean, that is what reading is, right? Reading is trying to go into the inner world,
Yeah,
ultimately.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and it is hit and miss.
Oh God, yes. Oh
It
God,
depends a lot on timing.
it does. And it depends on how rested you are. And also, haven't you seen a movie and then you go and get a coffee afterwards and you're both like, did we see the same movie? Like there's some things, but then you're like, you thought that was symbolic of this or that. Yeah. I've really enjoyed this.
Yeah, me too.
I hope it's inspiring our listeners.
To return to the epigraphs and
Yes.
also to read the Valerie essay, the Yalu, which is or dialogue, which is super delightful, and give Yakaboma a go. Six Theosophic Points is really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know, I used to love Hegel. Phenomenology of Spirit is one of my favorite books. So it's great to think of him that he was very inspired by him too. Thank you for sort of pointing that out. Oh.
Well, I mean, a lot of people see similarities between McCarthy and somebody like Schopenhauer.
Mm.
You know, but Schopenhauer was also like the world is will and, and representation, but it's will, you know,
Uh-huh.
and we can't really ever experience this will directly, except for perhaps in music, where we get direct representations of the will.
Mm.
But that would lead us into talking about Alicia's love for the violin as opposed to Blood Meridian.
Maybe that'll be a future adventures. I'm just gonna double check some of my little notes here. What do we get here? Yep, yep.
Yeah, it's pretty delightful the way all the epigraphs speak to the title. They play with the words in the title. They play with stuff that happens in the novel,
True.
and they reflect on the meaning of the novel and how the novel should be read, but they do so in a kind of obscure way that
Mm.
demands the reader's attention and effort.
Mhm. Again, because truth doesn't go in a straight line. It goes in a wavy line. You gotta be wavy.
Gotta be wavy.
Yeah. You know, I actually think I will go check out that Fraser's book. I never have read it. Have you read the whole book? Because it does sound pretty intriguing.
I have read large parts of it, but I think it's about like 900 pages long.
Oh, oh, oh,
So
it's that. Yeah, okay, that's a big one. Well, you know, I also want to remind everyone that the time is a social construct. We made that up. There is no time. There's definitely things that happen, sometimes repeated patterns like the moon, and we can track it. One of the reasons they were so clinging to the patterns of the moon, the shadow and the shapes, and that's why it's more reliable than the sun, because the sun looks the same all the time, but the moon changes, so it makes it more reliable, is that there is no such thing as time. So no wonder we want to be able to, what the hell, where am I today? You know, what day of the week is it? What's going on? Because we've made that up because it doesn't exist. We're just using the moon to try and feel like we have some clinging to reality,
so
or clinging to a non-reality, maybe.
no
Hmm.
such thing as time, only repetition.
Pretty much. Yeah, maybe not even repetition. That's our ego noticing that. Really. It's our habit energy.
That's
So
true.
really, yeah, it's habit energy. So, which also reminded me about when you said something about the battles and arguing, it reminded me of a famous Arjuna. If you ever hang out with anybody who's Hindu, is that you will end up talking about Arjuna had to go into battle, and he has to stick to what he wants to be dedicated to Krishna and to this new life of mysticism and the real nature of reality, not unlike Bohme um, or other mystics. And he goes into battle in the war. He looks across the field and it's all his cousins and parents and family. And it's like, yeah, you really have to be strong. You don't want to kill them, but you do have to be strong and stick by your thing. And I think any teenager would understand that too. Is like, oh no, I just want to wear these jeans, mom. I want to wear this super mini skirt. Hmm, I'm going into. But yes, everything is a battle, and we learn from that.
We must,
Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
must
And
follow the yoga of action.
yoga of action, I like it.
Isn't that Krishna's advice to Arjuna?
It is, yeah, yeah. Well, I really did enjoy this. I think we covered everything, right?
Probably.
If we
Probably.
didn't, I know I'll be driving in the car tomorrow and go, why didn't we say this?
Bye.
But we have next week's episode. This might be a special bonus one, and we really appreciate you listening. And we'd love you to give us a review in on your podcast app, wherever it is. There's a space on that to write a review. And I've already collected some really cool gifts. So whoever, I'm going to
Oh,
that randomly. It's going to be people who like Blood Meridian will like these gifts.
wow. That's very
We need
tempting.
some reviews. I know, John's. If you see somebody, what would be your fake name? Tomio? Michael? No, what was his name? Thomas Mann? Oh yeah.
Thomas Mann.
If Thomas Mann wrote a review, I know it's JVH. All right. We'll talk to you soon.
Okay, talk to you
Okay.
soon.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.